Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Arcserve webinar on the Arcserve UDP Agent. This is the first of a three-part series where we focus on the Arcserve UDP basics. My name is Armin Jihanyan. I'm the pre-sales consultant for Arcserve, and I'll be presenting today's session. Before we get started, if anyone has any questions during the session, please use the chat or preferably the questions section to type your questions in. And at the end of the session, we'll go through any questions that might come up. Today's agenda will be focusing on the Arcserve UDP agent, as I mentioned before. Before we do that, we'll have a high-level overview of the Arcserve UDP solution. We'll then take a look at the infinite incremental or I2 technology that Arcserve UDP uses for backup and how that actually differs from your traditional file-based backup. We'll then take a look at the different features that are available as part of the UDP agent. Obviously, we can do backup, but we can also do a copy of a recovery point or a copy of an actual backup image. And we've also got file copy and file archive capabilities within the agent as well. We'll then wrap it up with a live demo. We'll actually go through and see how we can create a backup plan, how we can do a copy of a recovery point, and how we can use file copy and file archive. At a high level, what we see with Arcserve UDP, which stands for Unified Data Protection, is our next generation simple and effective data protection product. What Arcserve UDP does is bring together what previously have been separate products by combining the capabilities of Arcserve Backup, Arcserve Replication and High Availability, or RHA, and what was previously Arcserve D2D into a single unified package. It's built on a unified architecture with a simple licensing scheme that can cover multiple editions of UDP with different features and functionality. The Arcserve UDP solution overall can protect both physical and virtual machines, and we can do centralized management through a unified management console. One of the components within Arcserve UDP that lets us do a lot of advanced features and functions is the recovery point server. And one of those key features that it brings is global deduplication. Now we'll talk about the recovery point server in a future webinar, but just wanted to point out that we can start with a simple agent-based deployment and then work our way up by adding different components in the UDP solution. We can work at it like a building block approach without needing forklift upgrades to get the full functionality of the product suite. At that full functionality level, we can perform replication between multiple sites. We can perform instant VMs where we can stand up a recovery point or a backup image into a virtual machine that's ready to run in VMware or Hyper-V. And we can then copy to tape backup images for long-term archival and compliance purposes. And of course, we have high availability functionality that we get thanks to the Arcserve RHA component. As you can probably see from this, the Arcserve UDP solution is actually very flexible and very comprehensive. It's probably best to think of it like an SLA dial, where we have good, better, and best. We can start using UDP and put a simple data protection policy in place. This is, if you want to think of this like a good protection, where we can do daily backups, whether that's the disk or the tape, and then we can do virtual standby for our key systems, and we can do quarterly or half-yearly DR testing. We can turn the dial to better, and with better we can not only do daily backups, but we can do multiple backups during the day so that we decrease the RPO. We have less potential data loss in the event something goes wrong because we have more backup points available. We can also perform replication to a DR site, and we can do remote virtual standby. So we can prepare machines to turn on at a DR site. Lastly, we can turn that dial to best, where we can handle multiple sites, whether they be multiple branch offices, a production site, and a DR site. And we can have data replicating between these sites so that you have multiple copies of the data in the case of site failure. We can perform network efficient and disk efficient backups and storage through deduplication. And for the most critical systems, we can enable full high availability. With full high availability, we can do near live replication of the data so that we're not relying on previous points in time, but in the event of a server or site failure, we can bring online a failover machine that has a more up-to-date copy of the data. Furthermore, with the full high availability, we can enable automated DR testing. So we can put a schedule in place that will test a failover machine coming online, and we can do that monthly, weekly, even daily if we want. And at the end of the automated DR test, we get a report that tells us whether the failover system came online, was successful, or if it wasn't. So all of these features and functionality is available within the single UDP solution. Let's take a step back and start looking at the way that we perform backups with the UDP agent. As I mentioned, with UDP, we perform a block-level backup using our infinite incremental technology, or I2 technology. This is a block-level backup of drives or volumes. This differs from a traditional file-based backup in that a block-level backup goes below the file system to the disk. So if we are protecting, for example, large files that might be multiple gigabytes in size, in a file-level protection scenario, in a file-level backup, if any part of that multi-gigabyte file changes, then the entire file has changed. Therefore, that entire multiple gig file needs to be backed up again. In a block-level backup, if a small part of that file has changed, we actually go down to the disk level and look at the blocks that have changed. So out of a multiple gigabyte file, maybe only a few megabytes has changed. Therefore, we only need to back up a few megabytes. As you can appreciate, this uses less disk space when we're doing backups themselves. And the consequence of that is, because we're backing up less data, we're using less network bandwidth. And the follow-on effect is that we're reducing the amount of time needed to perform the backup. Another key benefit of infinite incremental technology is that we only ever need to do one full backup, and that's going to be the first backup. We can, after we've taken our first full, we can do incrementals moving forward. We can also enable compression and encryption on those backups so that we, again, further improve disk usage and have savings on the disk space and improve the security in terms of access to the backup images. Lastly, even though we're doing backups of the entire volume or entire drives, we still have the capability of performing granular file folder restores, and if we want to do full system restores, we can do those, even to different hardware. So let's take a closer look how the two, the traditional backup and the infinite incremental backup, differs. if you have a traditional backup, the first backup will be full. This might be on a Friday so that you have the time over the weekend to perform the full backup on the system. We then will take incrementals over the next day. So for example, Monday through Thursday, we might take some incrementals. Then on the next Friday, we'll take another full backup. And then over the next few days, we'll perform incrementals again. So you can see in the regular process, we have a fair bit of disk space being used. If we compare this with infinite incrementals, we still take a full backup for the initial image, but then moving forward, we only ever need to take incrementals. So we end up saving a significant amount of disk space compared to the traditional model. Let's take a look at how this might work in practice. So let's take a look at a 3-week cycle. Our objective is to be able to restore a backup from any day from the last 2 weeks. With a traditional backup, this means we need to keep at least 2 full backup sets plus the current backup set. So let's see how that works. Again, let's start with a Friday full, and then Monday through Thursday, we'll take our incremental backups. This is the first week of backups, and with this data, with 1 full and 4 incrementals, we can restore data from any day in the last week. At the start of the second week, we're going to take another full, and then we're going to take incrementals again. Now at this point, we have 2 backup sets, and with this data available, we can restore data from any of the last 2 weeks. Now let's enter the third week. Again, we need to take a full on the Friday, and we take incrementals moving forward. Now if we were to say that today was Wednesday, and we want to restore data from 2 weeks ago, what data is required is the full data set in order to be able to restore anything in the last 2 weeks. In a best case scenario, we'll only have 2 weeks of data, but as soon as you go into a third week, you still need to retain the full set because you need the initial full and then the 3 incrementals to get to the week 1 Wednesday. If we take a look at the total data required, that's 3 full and 10 incrementals. Let's compare this to how infinite incremental technology works. With infinite incrementals, as I said, we only need 1 full, and then we take incrementals for however long we need. Now in our example, we want to keep 2 weeks worth of backups, and we're doing Monday to Friday. So that's 5 days in a week. For 2 weeks means we need to keep 10 backups or 10 recovery points. So let's see how this works. Again, let's start on a Friday where we take the first full, and then we take incrementals for the remaining week. Here, like before, we have the ability to restore anything from the last week with this data on hand. But keep in mind, even though we've taken the same full and incrementals, the incrementals will be smaller in size due to the block level backup we're taking. Let's go to the second week. You'll notice that now with infinite incrementals, we don't need to take another full. We can take another incremental. And then we'll continue taking incremental until we reach the number of backups or recovery points that we want to keep. In our case here, we want to keep 10. So here we have 1 full and then 9 incrementals, which gives us the 10 recovery points. What happens on the third week? is we take another incremental. So here at this point, we now have 11 backups or 11 recovery points, which is one more than we want to keep. We only want to keep 10. So what happens is after this 11th recovery point is taken as an incremental, we do something called a merge process. What merging does is it takes the full backup and then merges it with the oldest incremental. At the end of that merge process, that oldest incremental becomes a new full. The old full data gets marked for deletion and is eventually purged. So at the end of this process, we'll see we've got 10 recovery points again, 1 full and then 9 equals. On the next day, we take another incremental, and again, we are left with 11 recovery points at the end of this backup. So in order to get back to the 10, we do another merge process. This merge process works the same way. So the full merges with the oldest incremental. So the oldest incremental becomes the new full. The oldest full gets marked for deletion and is eventually purged. On the next day, we perform another incremental, and then we go through the merge process again. Oldest incremental is merged with the full. The old full gets marked for deletion, and that is eventually purged. So again, if we pretend that today is Wednesday and we want to restore data from 2 weeks ago, the data is available. And if we compare the data that we've saved compared to the traditional method, we have 1 full and 9 incrementals. And the incrementals are using block-based incremental backup, which means that they're smaller in size than a traditional file-based incremental. So from a backup perspective, as I mentioned, with Arcserve UDP Agent, we can perform a backup of individual volumes. So you can pick and choose which volumes you want to back up, or you can choose to back up the entire system. In our example that we went through, we were looking at a daily backup schedule, but with Arcserve UDP, we can set a daily schedule, a weekly, a monthly, and a custom schedule. And we can also create combinations of these. So we can have a daily, a weekly, and a monthly in place. So we can emulate like a GFS rotation on this. We can store a maximum of 1,440 recovery points per server across the different types, across the different schedules. So we can have a long-term retention, or if you're doing custom backups, we can back up as often as every 15 minutes. So we can have quite a number of recovery points or backups available to restore from. We are backing up to disk. So the destination for the backups can be either a file share, it might be on a file server or on a NAS device like a QNAP or a Synology NAS type device, or we can back up to a separate hard drive. Now that might be a separate internal disk that you're using just for backups, or it might be an external USB drive and we can send backups there. With Arcserve UDP, we can also support Microsoft Exchange, SQL, and Active Directory. As long as we're using UDP Advanced or higher, we can perform granular restore of Exchange emails, contacts, calendar items. We can do SQL database restores, and we can also perform Active Directory object and object attribute restores. And as mentioned before, we can of course do individual file folder restores or entire system restores, even to dissimilar hardware. We'll take a look at how we set this up in the demo coming up. But before we do that, let's take a look at some of the other features that are available with the agent. Let's say you've taken your backup and the backup destination has gone to a NAS. If you want to have a copy of that recovery point, we can perform that and send it to perhaps a USB drive which you can take off site or keep in a safe. To do that, we use the copy recovery point feature. We can use that to take a backup that's already been made and put a copy of that in a secondary location. That secondary location can be a drive, as I mentioned, or it can be another file share path. So it might be to another NAS, or it might be to a different server. And we can run this manually where we can choose which recovery point we want to make a copy of. Or we can set up a schedule so that a copy of the recovery point happens on a regular basis. If we do set up a schedule, then we can choose the number of recovery points to keep, and we can choose after how many backups we want a copy to run. So let's say you're doing daily backups. You can set a copy of a recovery point to happen every week. So you have daily backups on the NAS, and then you can have weekly backups copied to that secondary location. Another feature that we have is a file copy feature. With file copy, we can actually nominate a folder or multiple folders and choose different file types and criteria to use, and then after a backup is performed, these files can be copied to a secondary location. Like a copy recovery point, that secondary location can be a separate drive, or it can be a share path to another NAS, or with file copy, we can also send a copy of those files to cloud storage, such as Amazon S3 or Microsoft Azure. We can choose multiple directories. So for example, you might choose to back up the My Documents folder, and you might want to choose to back up a projects folder or any other key folders that you think you need to keep. Furthermore, when we do file copy, we can select the retention period based on period of time, and we can also choose the number of copies of the file to keep. So let's say, for example, we were backing up the My Documents folder. If a particular file in there changed, we can choose how many versions of that file to keep. So we have some flexibility in the way those files are handled. And then lastly, we'll look at the File Archive feature. File Archive works in a similar way to File Copy, in that we choose a directory or multiple directories, and we can choose the files or file types. And then we can set criteria for the files to be archived. The location, again, like File Copy, can be a file share, an external hard drive or a separate hard drive, or the cloud. The main difference with File Archive is that instead of just doing a copy of the file to that location, we're actually moving the file. When we move the file, we actually leave behind a stub, and that stub is just a text file, and that contains the location of the new file. So if you've archived off files that haven't been accessed for over 30 days or 60 days, and all of a sudden a user needs to access that, they can look in the stub file and it will tell them the new location of where that file now is. So let's recap the different sources and destinations for the backup with the Arcserve UDP agent. We'll start with a server, and then we'll install the Arcserve UDP agent onto that machine, and we can now protect it. Going to a file share, such as a NAS, or a separate hard drive, such as a USB drive, we can obviously do our backups. We can also do a copy of the recovery points to these destinations as well. If we want to be able to leverage clouds such as Amazon S3 or Microsoft Azure, we can do that. And we can use file copy or file archive to send individual files within folders that we nominate to the cloud or to a file share or to a hard drive. So I've spoken a lot about what we can do with the Arcserve UDP agent. Let's take a closer look. So I have the Arcserve UDP agent installed on a Windows server, and we access the UDP agent through a web browser. So here I have my browser open, and my server is called Demo03, and we connect through the port number 8014. This is the default port. You can customize it if you want. So I'm accessing this, and I'm logging in with an administrator account. And we can log in, and the first thing we see when we log in is a Getting Started guide. I'm okay with this. I'm just going to close this. And then underneath, we actually have a quick summary of what we have in terms of the last backup, whether it was successful or not, and that's in the form of this tick. It tells us how many recovery points we have. So I've got 3 manual backups that I've done, and I haven't set any dailies on this one yet. In terms of the backups that are also available, there's a calendar at the bottom here that shows green for the days that backups are available. Now, I used to have this backup a different way through to a recovery point server that we talked about before. So I recently changed that, which is why we still see green here. Not to confuse the matter, we'll take a look at recovery point servers later. But in terms of the backup destination now, we can see under the capacity, it's telling us where the backups are going. So in my case, backups are now going to a NAS box that I have, and it's called NAS01. And this destination has about 3.2 terabytes free. And this graph here shows how much disk space is actually used and how much disk space is free. So the gray is how much free space there is. We also see the license status. Now I'm running off the 30-day trial, and I'll go through how we can actually add a license to the UDP agent in a moment. And then we can see that it can contact the update server. If there are any updates, it can download them. So once we've logged in, what we want to do is, first of all, set up our backups. So to do that, we click on the Settings button here. So when we click on that, we have a tree on the left here, and we can see the protection settings. We can choose where the backup destination needs to go. So in this case, you can see it's going to this path on the NAS. If I had a USB hard drive connected, for example, and it was, for example, the E drive, I can just put in the path that I want to send it to. Although I'm using a NAS, so I can just put the NAS path in. And then once I put a NAS path in, I hit this green arrow, and I can put the credentials, the username and password I need to access that share. So if I hit Browse now, I can open that location and I can choose the folder that I want. So I want to send this to UDP Backup, and Demo03 is where it's going. Next, we can choose what we want to backup. I've chosen Backup All Volumes. This server only has a C drive and it's just a basic Windows install. However, I can choose what drives to back up. So it'll list all the drives that are available in the system. So you can see here I've got a C drive, and I have that system reserved partition. So I'm backing both of these up, so if I want to do a full system restore, everything is there. And you can see this is a 40 gig drive. However, I'm only using just under 15 gig of space. So it's only going to be backing up the actual data. It won't back up the blank space. If we keep going down, we can see we've got some options for the data format. Generally speaking, the older D2D, before we went to UDP, used the standard format. With UDP version 6, we can use this advanced format, which gives us some additional compatibility and enhancement to the actual backup size and the way the backup's done. We can choose compression. We default to standard compression, which gives you a good compromise between amount of compression and the time it'll take to do the compression. But we can choose no compression or maximum compression if we want to alter that setting. Lastly, we can choose the encryption. By default, we don't encrypt the data, but you can choose different level of encryption, 128, 192, or 256-bit. And if you enable encryption, you provide the encryption password. So I'm going to select no encryption here. Once we've set the protection settings, the destination, and so on in the source, we now select the schedule on the left. So if I click on schedule, you'll see that by default it has this daily incremental backup schedule. It does a backup for 7 days at 10 p.m. If I want to modify this, I can click on this daily incremental backup. And I don't want to do backups on the weekend, so I'm going to do Sunday and Saturday is going to be unticked. Now, what I want to do like a GFS. I want to have a week of dailies, 5 weeks of weeklies, and I want to have a year of monthlies available. So what I'm going to do is my dailies are going to be run on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So I'll untick that, and a week of that is going to be 4 of these dailies. So I'll save this. Now I want to add a weekly schedule to run on Fridays. So I'll click on Add, and I'll add a backup schedule. And instead of, from the first drop-down, I'm going to choose a weekly schedule. Now what you'll notice here, I've got options for the backup type. I can have full, verify, or incremental. A full backup, as you'd expect, would perform a full backup just like it would normally, and it's going to use that additional disk space because we're doing a full. A verify lets us check that what's on the server matches what's being backed up, so it'll go back and forth and check between the two. Most of the time we're going to choose an incremental. Even if we haven't done a backup before, if we choose an incremental, it will automatically do the first backup as a full. If I have any existing backups, however, I can use an incremental, and I can have incrementals across daily, weekly, and monthly, so that just like we saw before in my example, we don't have to take new fulls every week or every month. I'm going to select incremental here. I'll let that run at the same time at 10 p.m. on Fridays. We can choose different days of the week, and we can choose different start time based on the schedule here. And then we choose how many backups we want to keep. I want to keep a month's worth of weeklies, so by having 5, that'll cater for that 5 weeklies, which is a month. So I'll save that. And you'll notice now that I have a daily and a weekly in my schedule. I can further add to that, and I can add a new backup schedule, and that might be a monthly. So I'll select monthly here. That's going to be incremental as well. That can run at 10 p.m., and I'll choose which day of the week I want that to run. So I can choose to run that on the 1st of the month, or I can choose to run it on the last day or on a particular date. Alternatively, I can choose to run it on the first or last particular day of a month. In my case, I want to run this backup on the last day of the month. And I want to have 3 years retention, so I want to keep 36 monthlies. And then I'll click Save. So now I have like a GFS style rotation on disk. If I want to change the number of backups that I want to keep, I can go back and modify these, or I can just come down here to this recovery point retention section and alter the numbers. You'll notice that we've also got an entry here for custom or manual backups. This always needs to be at least 1 so that you have the ability to just do a backup now, a manual backup of the machine. In my case, I've got 5, but I can reduce that or I can increase that if I want to. Maybe I want to take a manual backup before I do a service pack install or before I install a major application. I have that flexibility. You also have options for cataloging. Generally not required unless you're doing a lot of restores. By cataloging, we can actually perform faster searches for particular files and search in the different recovery points. Once we've got the schedule sorted, we can click on the advanced entry on the left here. And within the advanced section, I'll just scroll up, we can choose to perform functions such as truncating the Exchange or SQL logs if we're backing up Exchange or SQL. We can choose what kind of snapshot we're doing. Now, if we do decide to move to and employ the UDP console, which is actually the topic of our next webinar, we can leverage hardware snapshotting. So for now, we're just going to use software snapshots. And then we're going to choose what account we're going to use to perform the log truncation and so on. So I'll put my details in there. Lastly, under the pre and post backup settings, we can select a particular username and then put scripts or commands that will run before a backup is done, after the snapshot's taken but before the data is transferred, or after the backup itself is completed. And we can choose to put those scripts or those commands in, and they'll run based on the username and password entered here. So this is pretty standard on most backup applications. In my case, I don't need to save any of, I'm not going to run any pre or post job scripts, and so I can hit Save Settings. So if I save those settings, they'll be applied at the agent, and the next time the backup will run, which is scheduled for, and we'll see it here, so our next backup is scheduled for 10 o'clock tonight based on the schedule we set. And you'll see here, it's telling us we've got no dailies, no weeklies, or no monthlies because the time hasn't elapsed yet and we haven't run those on their schedule. We can still run a backup now. I'm going to hit backup now, and I can choose to do an incremental, a verify, or a full backup. I'm going to do an incremental. And if you want to put a comment in for this, so maybe this is before you install something, you can put that comment in. I'll hit OK, and now that's going to kick off an incremental backup. Now I can click on Details, and it'll give me some more information. And now it's taking a snapshot, so that that snapshot will then be backed up. And because we're doing only a block level backup, I've only had 116 meg of changes on this server since the last backup happened. So you can see here, in less than 20 seconds, my incremental backup has completed. If I want to then do a copy of a recovery point, I can do a manual copy by clicking on the copy recovery point entry here. This will then let me pick a particular recovery point. So here I've got 4 recovery points, 4 manual ones that I've done. One that I've just run now, and then I've run 3 previously today. So let's say I might want to restore the image I took or copy the 9 o'clock image that I took. So this happened at 9:01. I can select this recovery point, and then I'll go next. And now I can choose the destination. So here I can type in a NAS path. And again, I'm going to hit the arrow so I can authenticate against this share. And now I want to put this in copy RP, so copy recovery point. I can then choose the compression and encryption for the copy. And then I can hit create a copy. And it'll now go and perform a copy of that recovery point. You'll notice that even though that 9 o'clock backup, so we can see here 9:01, this was an incremental backup that happened. When we do a copy recovery point, the recovery point that gets created is like a full that gets created. So we can use that on its own as a standalone restore point. And that's about just under 15 gig, which is the size of my server. Let's say I want to do copy recovery points automatically. What I can do is if I go back into the settings, there's a section in the tree for copy recovery points. So if I click on that, by default, copy recovery points is not enabled. So I enable that, and then I choose the destination of where I want to send that to. I might put it here. Hit the green arrow, authenticate against the location. And now we can choose when we want to do the copy recovery point. So we can do this after a certain number of backups are done. So if I want to do this weekly, I can say after 5 backups, do a copy of the recovery point. And then I can choose how many recovery points I want to keep in this destination. Maybe I only want to keep the last month's worth of these weekly, so I'll choose 5. And then I have standard and no encryption selected. I can modify those if I want to. So once I'm happy with those, I can hit save. And it'll start counting from the next backup. So from the next backup after 5, it'll do a copy recovery point. So, okay, so it's currently doing a copy to that location, which is why it's not letting me do it. Let's browse and choose a different location. Let's just create a new folder here. I'll just call it copy RP2 just for our demonstration here. And I'll save. Again, just taking a little bit of time because we've got a job running to that same location at the moment, and my network here isn't the fastest. So we'll now save those settings, and we're back here. Last thing I wanted to show is the file copy and file archive. So those are, as you'd expect, under the settings again. If I click on settings, this time we've already covered the backup, we've covered the file copy, we've covered the copy recovery point. File copy is here in this section on its own. And just like copy recovery point, it's not enabled by default. So we tick the box to enable file copy. When we do that, we can choose to copy files from certain backups that run. So if you want them to be copied only from the weekly backups or a combination of these, you can choose that. So I want to do it from dailies and weeklies. If you don't want to choose that particular schedule, you can also choose to do a copy after every certain number of backups. In our example, I want to take from daily and weekly backups, and then we have file copy sources. So what we do here is we need to actually select the directory where we want to copy files from. So if, for example, you wanted to do like the My Documents directory, it might be the C users, the username and documents. If we hit Browse, you can see here I've got a number of different folders that are in that particular directory, and I'll go OK. And then you want to choose what files in that directory you want to copy. Now, excuse me, we can choose to either include particular files or exclude particular files. And we can choose. So let's say, for example, I wanted to back up everything. And I want to back up all the folders as well. So that will back up all files and all folders within the Documents directory. If I only wanted to back up, say, Microsoft Word docs, I might do doc asterisk, that'll include .doc and .docx, and so on. So once you're happy with that, we've got the path. If you had another folder, like maybe a project folder, you can just go in and you can type in the path that you want to protect there. Once you've selected the source, we now need to choose the destination. So here we can type in, just like before, we can type in a share path and then type the rest of the path in. Or if we had a hard drive connected, we can type in the path of the hard drive. Or if you want to send a copy to the cloud, we can click on File Copy to Cloud, click on Configure, and then we can choose which storage service we want to send this to. So I might want to send this to Amazon S3. So what I might do is then put in my access key ID. And then you put in your secret access key. And then you choose your bucket. So I'm just going to hit refresh, and I'm going to let it connect and see what buckets are there. So I've got one bucket created, but I might want to add a new one, and you can just type in the name there. And you can choose the different regions. So this one here is in Singapore at the moment. I'm just going to choose that because it's already created. And you have options to enable reduced redundancy storage. So it's happy, it's accepted those cloud destinations, and then we can choose compression and encryption if we want to. And then lastly, we have the retention. So you can choose to retain a certain number of recent versions of the file, or files that were copied in the last certain number of days, months, or years. So you have the option of choosing which way you want to keep them. So you might want to keep the last 5 versions. And then we've got the schedule option. So with schedule, we can choose to do a copy immediately after a backup is made, or we can set a schedule so file copy runs at certain times. So normally your backups run out of hours, so doing the copy out of hours immediately would make sense, but you have the option there. So I'm going to change this back to immediately after recovery points are generated, and that's how we can do file copy. File archive is done in a similar way. So if we click on the file archive settings, we can enable that because it's disabled by default. Similarly, we need to select our path. So what folder are we going to do this in? Maybe I want to use my documents folder again. This time, I want to archive off every PDF. And you can filter by size. So you can say filter based on files that are between certain sizes, less than or greater than. So I want to archive off any PDFs that are bigger than a meg. At the same time, files that have not been accessed in the last 3 months, they can also be archived off that meet this file size filter. If I just want to use an age filter, I can disable the size filter. And this way, any files in that folder that match this file value will be archived off. I'll hit OK. We then choose the destination, and we choose the destination exactly the same way as before. So we can put our credentials in for a cloud provider if we want to send it to cloud. Or we can put a path in to send it to. And then again, we have options for compression and encryption. And then we have retention. Because we've moved the file and archived it, the default retention is 4 years. So you have the option of modifying that if you like. At the end of this retention time, the data will automatically be deleted. And lastly, we have schedule. So in this case, we've got a schedule for when that happens. Once we're happy, we can hit save. And once my network catches up, it'll save those settings. And the next time the backup runs, it'll also do copy recovery point, file copy, or file archive based on what our settings have been. It's going through, it's checking the different destinations for the different settings again. While it does that, mindful of the time, just want to let you know that, as I said, this is the first of the series of 3 webinars. I invite you and remind you to join us for the next one, which introduces the Arcserve UDP console. So with the Arcserve UDP console, we can enhance the capabilities of the UDP solution. We can leverage the UDP agent, and we can, instead of having to log into the agent directly, we can centrally manage all the servers that we're backing up by creating plans centrally. We can push the agents out to the machines from the console. We can also use the console to perform agentless VM backups. So if you're looking to do a backup, an agentless backup of Hyper-V or VMware virtual machines, the console is a must. And of course, with the console, we can create, we can view reports, we can look at stats across the environment, and we can create schedules to push reports out on a regular basis. So instead of relying on email alerts to tell you whether things were successful or not, you can create a report that gives you a summary of the backups, and you can have that sent to you daily or weekly or on a schedule that you like. So that's in 2 weeks' time. So that's on Friday, 6th of May. Again, at the same time, it's 12 p.m. for me. And you can use the same registration link you had before, but choose the second webinar link to register for that. And I've also got a tiny URL link on the page as well. This really covers the majority of the topic for the agent, at least for this session. If you're interested in a deep dive or you're after any additional details on Arcserve UDP, Arcserve backup, or replication and high availability, you can contact myself or my colleague Andrew Huntley. Both our details are on the screen at the moment, and I'll leave them up for the time being. I'll go through and see if there's any questions, and we'll go through those in the next couple of minutes for now. So we've got one question here. Is the UDP agent or UDP managed console the same thing? So the UDP agent and the UDP console are two different components. The UDP console is installed on a Windows server, and we log into that console on that machine through a web browser in a similar fashion. And from that console, we can manage all the other agents. With the agent, we need to log into the agents directly. So if you had 3 machines with only the agents installed, you need to log into each agent on each machine separately and set up a backup path. Whereas with the console, you can create one job and have that sent out, pushed out to all the agents at once. Video is being recorded, so we'll work on getting the links out after that's done. And another question here is, does the agent work on physical and virtual machines as well? The answer is yes. So if you don't want to use the UDP console and you still have virtual machines, you can install the UDP agent within a VM. We support a number of operating systems. So the main Windows operating systems are there, the usual Linux flavors are there. For the full list of supported operating systems, I recommend you visit our support page, and it has the up-to-date list of operating systems and applications that we support. That web page is arcserve.zendesk.com, Z-E-N-D-E-S-K, and there's a link that takes you to the software compatibility list. That's probably going to be a lot more accurate and up-to-date compared to what I'm saying now. But the usual Windows operating systems are supported. And then there's a question here in regards to, is there a way to expire retention in terms of age instead of recovery point quantity? The short answer is yes. What we can do is we still work in regards of recovery points because that is our unit of measure. So if you're choosing a certain number of recovery points and you want to reduce or expire, you can reduce the number of recovery points to keep. And the next time the backup happens, the merge process will happen on multiple recovery points till you get down to the number you want to keep. Again, you can choose different recovery points for daily, weekly, monthly, so you can have a customized retention for each. question of the agent and how to get it. The agent is actually available as part of the UDP download package on the Arcserve website. So if you go to the Arcserve website, arcserve.com, and you download the trial, the agent is actually part of UDP. When you go through the installer, you can choose to install just the agent component. And there is a question about backing up workstations and notebooks. The agent can be installed on Windows 7, 8, and 10, and we can protect the workstations as well, and that's all with the same installer. There's another question about a host being removed from a plan. How are the recovery points cleaned up? With the UDP agent, there's no overall plan. Each agent is configured separately. If you decide to stop doing backups or remove a particular server from doing backups, the recovery points are kept in the location. So we're not deleting them if you're stopping backups, or if you uninstall the UDP agent, the backups are still kept in their location so that you can access them to do restores. So great questions that are there. If there's any other questions, we've got maybe another minute or so. One last question is there a way to remove or delete a recovery point? Due to the way that we do the incrementals, there is no way to pick and choose a particular recovery point to delete, because it might be required as part of the chain for a recovery point later on. If you want to reduce the number of backups you're keeping, so for example, if you're running out of disk space, or if you decide that you no longer need to keep, say, 36 monthlies, you can reduce that down to 12. Within the settings, you can go into the schedule and you can reduce the number of recovery points to keep. After you reduce that and save the settings, the next time a backup runs, it will automatically reduce the number of recovery points down to what you've selected. So that might mean doing a merge multiple times. So another question is, can we do copy to Microsoft Azure? We can do file copy and file archive to S3, Microsoft Azure. We can also do it to Eucalyptus. So there's a number of different cloud providers that we can actually send that to. Okay, we're probably running close to, if not gone a little bit over our time. So if there are no other questions, again, I'd like to thank you for attending today's session. I'd like to encourage you to register and attend the next webinar, which is in 2 weeks' time. And if there are any other questions or you're after more information, both Andrew's and my details are on screen, so I encourage you to reach out, drop us an email or give us a call. We're more than happy to discuss and go into more detail about the Arcserve solution. But until then, again, I'd like to thank you for your attendance and hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you.